and he prayed to the living God, who is the only one that should truly get glory and honor. And so these evil men, they were down there looking up. Yep, see, there he is. There he is. We knew it. He was going to pray. So they ran to the king and says, "Oh, king, live forever. Remember that law that you signed into effect? Well, your servant, that Hebrew slave, Daniel, is praying to his God." And Darius, I've been duped, because he really liked Daniel. And so he said, he tried to come all day trying to think of a way to get out of this. But then the men came back at sundown and said, "Remember, king, once you sign it into order, you can't back out. You have to do this." So he went to Daniel, and he was so sorry. And he said, "I know that this God that you can serve is able to save you, but there's nothing I can do." So they put him in the lion's den, and they put a stone on top, and he put his seal, and he worried, and he fretted all night. And as soon as the sun came up, he ran out there, and he says, "Oh, Daniel, was your God able to save you?" And he said, "Yes, here I am. God sent an angel of the Lord to come down and shut these lions' mouth." And so they praised God. Now, the people that had done this evil deed, the king was not happy with, and he gave them a just punishment. But it should be our habit every day to pray to God and to only God. And we should do that right now. Dear God in heaven, we thank you so much for being such a good and faithful God and taking care of your people who love you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, you can return to your seats.
Pardon me, doing two things at once, doing the PA and called worship. Thank you all for joining us this morning, both in person here at the church and also those that have joining us online. Let's see. We have a special announcement that Bob wanted to bring to us, so I'll start with that.
Good morning. I just received some information here that was asked to be passed on to our church family. Our friend and member, Milton Campbell, is currently in the hospital, and he has some serious medical challenges. So his request is that you keep him in prayer, add him to the member prayer list. So Milton Campbell needs your prayers today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. We have a first reading for transfer membership from Port Orchard. Tegan Cobb to Columbus Eastwood SDA Church in Westerville, Ohio. Do I have a motion? Second? Second. All in favor? All right. We also have Jessica Palmer to the Shelton SDA Church. Do I have a motion? I have a motion. Second. All in favor? So moved. Levi Cobb to the Refuge SDA Company in Seattle. Do I have a motion for that? I have a motion. Do we have a second? Second, all in favor? And last one, Ashley, Samuel, and Jaden Finney to the LifeBridge Adventist Company in University Park. I have a motion for that. First, second, all in favor? Thank you. And please review the other announcements in the bulletin. Thank you for joining us.
Morning. Happy Sabbath, everyone. Thank you. I know it's difficult to be doing double duty back there, trying to turn all the microphones on and everything at the same time and do announcements, so thank you for that. Well, for those of you who I may have not met yet, my name's Pastor Natalie, and if we have not had a chance to chat before, I want to encourage you to pull out one of these blue cards. They're usually in the seat backs in front of you, or one of the greeters can help you find them, and fill out your information, your name, and pull me aside afterwards. I'd love to talk to you. And when you're done with it, you can either put it in the offering basket in the back or give it to one of our greeters. But we're glad that you are here joining us today. I want to read a Bible verse and then pray, and you can see it on the screen there. Like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. And as you know, we've been going through a series that we've just started about habits and how they impact our lives. And I think that this verse, which we'll revisit a little later in the sermon, is a powerful one to think about that metaphor. Like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. Let's pray. Dear God, I want to thank you for being with us on this Sabbath day, and I want to ask that you continue to be with the different ministries that are going on in this church at this time. Our Pathfinder Club that is thriving this year, our young people doing well, all of our different Bible studies and small groups. Continue to bless those ministries in our community and our church family. And today we especially want to lift up Milton to you. You know everything that he is going through, and today I know the family has just some very important things going on with him, and so we ask that you'd be with them today as they make some of those decisions and talk with doctors that are helping take care of him. And be with each one of us in the different personal prayer requests that we have as well. Thank you for your love for us. In your name, amen. During my last few semesters in Michigan, I lived in this super tiny little apartment, and I tried to find a good picture of it. I didn't really have a great one to show you, but I lived in this really small apartment that was above someone's house in Michigan, right on a corner of the street. And the stairs up to this apartment were so narrow, just to give you an idea of how small it was. They were so narrow that if I was taking like 2 grocery bags up the stairs, I had to walk like sideways in order to get all my groceries up. Or if I was carrying anything, it was like you had to do this awkward maneuver to get up the stairs. It was so tiny. When you got to the top, the ceiling was slanted on both sides, so I really was in an attic. The kitchen ceiling was slanted, the bathroom shower was a slanted ceiling, my bedroom, there was a little slant above the bed. It was kind of a studio-style apartment, very small, so you get the idea. When I was standing in the bathroom, sometimes I could feel like I could touch all 4 walls. It was that small. But even though it was a really tiny little apartment, quite affordable at the time, I enjoyed having this little space all to myself, and I made it cozy up there. And I felt like it was my little nest above the world. I could look down on the streets, and I'm someone that unfortunately is a notorious eavesdropper, Eddie will tell you. And so I would love to leave my windows open and listen to all the fun things that were going on as kids passed by after school, learned all kinds of things about my neighbors. So I had a good view from my little nest out there, and sometimes just before bed, especially in the summer months in Michigan when it's hot, I'd leave those windows open and I'd sit in the silence and just kind of listen to the sounds of nighttime and the city getting quiet. I mean, the city being a very, very small town, and would just kind of soak it in the evenings. Sometimes I'd hear the laughter of my downstairs neighbors. Sometimes I'd hear few little noises from animals outside. And one evening, I heard a different sound than I was expecting. It sounded a little different than the sounds I was used to hearing. It was late. The streets were quiet. Cars had stopped driving. Berrien Springs is very small. And neighbors had mostly gone to bed, so there wasn't much awake that time of night. Well, I was in my bathroom, and I was getting ready for the evening, and I heard something like a kind of like a faint scratching or almost like a screeching sort of sound in the wall of my shower. And it kind of sounded like a little squeak. And I very quickly figured out that this was an animal sound. This was not something the downstairs neighbors were doing. And I listened and was like, oh, did I just hear that? No, I don't want to freak myself out. But I listened closer, and again, I heard those little like scratching, screeching noises. And it's a small bathroom, so it felt like they were like right next to my head. I listened more intently, and then my gut knew what the sound was. I didn't want it to be, but I Google searched what I thought it was just to be sure, and sure enough, Google confirmed for me that this little scratching, squeaking sound coming from my wall was most likely bats. Yay! And I did not want to meet these little critters in person at all, of course, so I freaked out. I'm literally living in an attic with bats, apparently. So I remember taking videos of the wall, like putting the phone up as close as I could to try and capture the sound, and I sent the video to all of my family, hoping my dad was awake that night, sent it to Eddie, sent it to the downstairs neighbors. I think this is bats, what do we do? I was freaking out, really didn't want to have to deal with those. And that night, I tried to get some sleep, but over the next few nights, I slept fitfully and definitely dreamt about bats a few times. Well, my housemate downstairs, that was kind of the landlord of the property, she ended up calling an exterminator to come and have an inspection done for us, and to our collective horror, yes, they found that there were bats in the attic. But not just one or two bats, not just a little family of bats, no. There were hundreds, they told us, hundreds of bats, apparently, that had decided that our attic was the perfect place to live. And the way the house was structured, the attic had this living area where I was that they had kind of remodeled to a living space, and then next to it was like a wall and then the empty attic space above where my downstairs neighbors lived. So literally, just a little wall that was separating us. I did not like the thought of that. When they did the inspection, of course, they told us that bats have toxic poop, as you know, and that toxic poop had filled up the attic, and so they told us about the process that they would have to go through in order to get rid of the bats and seal up the holes and clean up the attic. It was quite a long process, but thankfully, we did get it done. Now, I think this is a great metaphor for habits, because we all have things that are hiding under the surface in our lives. Habits that we need to break, things that are eating us out from the inside, habits that need to be exterminated from our spiritual lives in order for us to have emotional maturity, things that are getting in the way of our physical well-being, all kinds of bad habits. And much like those bats that were in my attic, we all have habits that we like to keep hidden, that we like to ignore. But over time, they create a buildup of all sorts of behavioral patterns in our life that can be very damaging to us and to our relationship with others and our relationship with God. Part of God's work in our hearts, I think, the way that the Holy Spirit works on us, is to help us with the job of uncovering those hard truths, the things that are sometimes hard for us to face. And though facing bats in your attic, literally or metaphorically, can be terrifying, it's a necessary part of the work that Jesus does in our hearts to shape our character to be more like his. Now, there's a great book on habits. There's many great books on habits, but one of them is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And in this book about habit, of course, he shares a scientific research study that was done. It was conducted to look at severe addicts who had been able to miraculously turn their lives around, and look at why and how they did this. They looked at people who were able to break those really strong addiction habits and focused on how they did it in such a short period of time. That's specifically what they were studying. Not just people with broken habits, but specifically people who had been able to do it quickly, faster than most people would. And they wanted to see if there was something like special in these people's brains, if there was some way that their brain was different, or some way that they were able to do this differently than how most people would function. They wanted to look for some sort of commonality in their experience and figure out, like, what's the secret to breaking bad habits quickly. And these researchers examined a girl named Miranda, and they looked at her and the other people on a neurological level. So they hooked them up to all kinds of things, and I'm not a scientist, so I couldn't tell you the names of how it's all done, but they were able to study how her brain was functioning. And in Miranda's case, she had been addicted to cigarettes for many, many years, much of her life, and it had contributed to a very unhealthy lifestyle. It had led her down a very bad path. And she'd done this for a long time. It was one of those habits that she knew was bad, but she had just chosen to live with it. She could see the ways that it was destroying her life, but she had just given up on ever trying to change it because anything she tried just never seemed to work. But at the time of the research study, she had been able to kick the addiction in quite a short amount of time. And so the researchers were looking into her life and trying to figure out how she got into this much healthier place and got rid of that cigarette addiction so suddenly. Well, Miranda shared her story with the researchers, who compassionately listened as she talked about her ex-husband, who had betrayed her severely and who had left her to go have a relationship with another woman. And after he left her, Miranda ended up in a very depressed state, naturally. And so she chose that she was going to try and go travel as a way to distract herself from the pain of the things that she was experiencing. But even as she tried these methods of trying to travel and different things to distract her, she still found herself helpless and ashamed and angry as she struggled with all of the feelings that she had and battled the depression that she was facing. One evening, she had a scary experience where she was just so distraught and delusional that she tried to light, I believe it was a plastic pen, on fire instead of an actual cigarette, causing a little plastic fire to take place and an issue in her hotel room. And that kind of scary moment woke her up, snapped her out of it, and made her realize, I've got to do something to change my life. I'm going down a really bad path. She realized she needed to turn her life around, and so she decided she was going to pick a goal, just one goal, something that she could do to try and feel positive about her life, something that she could look forward to. So Miranda decided, she got this idea in her head, that she was going to go on a trek with a travel group across the Egyptian desert. She really wanted to do this. And so because she was thinking about breaking these bad habits and trying to get on a better path with her life, and she'd picked this one goal, somehow she got it in her mind that, you know what, in order to prepare for this trip, I need to quit smoking. She knew that in order to do this trek, she needed to be healthier, she needed to be more physically fit, and she knew it would take a little bit of time to get to that point, and so she gave herself a year to get ready for the trip. She booked the trip a year out and decided, all right, over this year, I am going to prepare for this goal of going on this trek across the Egyptian desert. And she knew it would be difficult, but because she got it in her mind that she had to quit smoking in order to go on the trip, and she really wanted to go on the trip, she was able to start focusing on kicking that habit. When the researchers met Miranda, she was a very different person. She was in a very different place. And the woman that she described to them was definitely not the same person as who was sitting in front of the researchers and talking to them that day. She'd become a woman who ran marathons. She was happily engaged. She was living a balanced lifestyle, eating well, exercising regularly. She had a much more balanced life than before. And as they studied her brain and looked into these changes that had taken place, they found something fascinating. They could still see the neurological patterns of her old habits. Those things still showed up in her brain scans. They could see where that activity was taking place, the old bad habit of smoking. But they noticed something interesting. Those neural pathways that had been made had essentially been overridden by this new habit of running. And those old impulses that were kind of the triggers or things that would set her off and make her want to go and smoke a cigarette again, they were no longer as strong because they'd been crowded out by a bunch of new impulses related to her new habit of running and exercise and eating healthy and the things that kind of triggered her for wanting to do those activities. And so essentially, the way Miranda's brain and her habits had changed was that she had picked just one goal, one habit in her life that she wanted to change. She'd picked just this one pattern, and she started there, only with kicking the cigarettes. And had not really intentionally, but kind of inadvertently had replaced that bad habit with the good one of running. And Duhigg, in his book, he calls this a keystone habit. So it's basically like the one habit that if you can change that, it's like a domino effect, and a lot of the other little bad habits in your life, if you can fix that one, the others will follow and be a lot easier for you to change. So it's kind of like those bats in the attic. If you clean their poop up, great. But you don't take care of the bats. They're just going to come back and make more of a mess, right? You've got to get rid of the bats. You got to plug the holes wherever they were getting in, and then clean out all of the nastiness if you don't want them to come back. Well, in the Bible, we heard the story very greatly told earlier. There's this guy named Daniel. And I won't retell the story since you've heard it today and you know it well, but you know he was stolen from his homeland, he was taken to Babylon, and then likely because of his status back in Israel, he was able to be put into this training program for the king. He gained status there, education, and Daniel was able to stand out in this foreign land, and he was known to be a follower of God. And we see that in his early stories with the food that you could go and read and review later, and we see that later in the story of Daniel in the lion's den and this habit of prayer that he had. And that one habit, I think, is what allowed God access into his life and allowed God to have so much power and work through David in such a miraculous way. Daniel consistently prayed. We see that in Daniel 6. That's where you can go and read about it. We see that he had this habit of consistent prayer 3 times a day, every single day. This was Daniel's habit. And each day, it tells us, as part of that prayer, he gave thanks to God. And if you remember from some of our mental health meetings last year, we talked a little bit about how thankfulness and that sort of an attitude can help change your brain to be more positive. And so I think that this habit that he had of prayer really changed his life in powerful ways and gave God that access to him, and also gave Daniel that strength in order to do ministry in this place. God took Daniel's simple prayer habit and he was able to use it for big things. Pastor Craig Groeschel puts it like this. He says, never underestimate how God can start something big through one small habit. And we talked about that a little bit last week too. A small habit, it can have that huge domino effect in your life. And God can use just one small, consistent habit in your life to make a huge difference years later. And the Bible's full of passages and stories about this idea of forming habits in your life, about having self-control, about having willpower over things in your life. And I want to revisit that Proverbs metaphor from Proverbs 25 that says, like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. You can see exactly how that metaphor works, right? A city or a house with a wall smashed through, stuff can get in, right? It's a sad metaphor maybe, but it's a good one for us to understand how it works, how habits can creep in and they can consume things in your life. They can take over, they can cause you to have a lack of self-control, kind of like the idea of like warriors conquering an old city. But that is why I think one of the most prevalent things that's talked about in the New Testament kind of boils down to the building up of spiritual defenses. When you start to read through the New Testament, you'll see this idea reflected over and over again, building up these spiritual defenses, you could say, in your life. So you could think about verses about like putting on the armor of God, for example. That's building up those spiritual defenses. You can think of Paul's writings. He talks a lot about self-discipline in your life. Or you can think of the many times that believers in the early church are encouraged to do things together, like they're encouraged to worship together, to gather together, to eat, to pray, to fellowship with one another. They're encouraged in these building of spiritual habits. Because God knows that by developing spiritual habits in our life, He can help us to build up those walls of defense against the things that the devil tries to throw at us. I love the beginning of Romans, so that's the other verse that we'll kind of reflect on. Romans 12, the beginning of Romans 12, verse 2 specifically, that says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by" what? "The renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." And it's talking about God's will there. What in His will for you, what in His good and acceptable and perfect will is for you. Now, when I was in seminary, I remember thinking about this verse a bit, and during that time in seminary, we had options for the classes we could take. The way it usually works is you've got to take a class on preaching, you've got to take a class from the Old Testament or the New Testament or whatnot, but you have a list of a bunch of options that you can choose from in order to fulfill that credit, for example. And so for my preaching credit, I had to look through all the different options that there were. There was a variety of professors that I could choose to take my preaching class from. And one semester I saw that Pastor Dwight Nelson was teaching a class on preaching. And he had been a preacher I looked up to very greatly when I was in high school. I had listened to a lot of his sermons, and so I got really excited about the idea of taking a preaching class from this great preacher and learning from him. So I quickly signed up for it, and I rearranged my class schedule so I could make it work to take this preaching class. And as I went into the class, I fully expected that I was going to learn about the skillful art of homiletics, that I was going to learn about his expert technique in preaching, that I was going to learn how to apply biblical learning to your preaching really well, and so many other things. But on the first day, when I looked over the syllabus and when we started reading through things, I was a little bit surprised. I thought that we were taking class on preaching, but as you look through the syllabus and all the required textbooks, it looked much more like it was a class on prayer. And what followed in our class periods also felt like we were learning how to pray better rather than preach better. And sure, some of the homework was related to preaching. We did have to do little sermons, and we had to be prepared for, teachers will give pop quizzes. In a preaching class, you have to be prepared to give the worship that morning without notice of who's going to be giving it that day. So we did have those little things, but a lot of the readings that we read through in our class were focused on prayer. And so I walked away with something from that preaching class that was very different than what I expected. Pastor Dwight wanted to instill in his preaching pastors the habit of prayer first. And once that habit was established, I don't know, the picture, maybe I'll have you go to the next picture. Once that prayer habit was established, he made it clear that only then could a pastor ever hope to be any sort of good orator at all. It became clear to me what incredible depth he had in his own personal prayer life with Jesus, and it inspired me as a young pastor to pray more and make that a more intentional part of my own personal life and my ministry as well. And it helped me shift my mind, I think for many of us in the class, away from trying to be this amazing preacher that's admired, which I think many pastors often want. And instead, he turned our minds towards being a more prayerful person, a moment in your life that most people will never see. That's not something that will be looked upon by others and admired, in the same way at least. And I learned that semester that what makes a great preacher or great pastor is what fueled much of Jesus' own teaching ministry as well. Jesus had a bountiful and powerful prayer life. We see that the many times that he takes time away to pray and be with the Father, and how that fueled the rest of what he did. And that habit, it was an incredibly important one, not only for Jesus, but also for his followers as well in the New Testament. And I think it's a powerful one for us as Jesus followers today, whether or not you like to get up front and preach or share worship thoughts or lead Bible studies publicly. We all have different personalities, and that's okay. But I still think that habit of prayer is an essential one if you want to claim to be a follower of Jesus at all. You don't have to do it perfectly, but I think God wants you to at least give it a try. Okay, so we've talked about all this, these habits, and this is all nice, right? But how do I practically go about breaking a bad habit and then starting a good new one? What do I do? How do I do that when I keep putting it off? If you're one of those people like me who sometimes struggles with procrastination, how do you break those bad habits and start new ones if you just keep pushing it off until tomorrow, Well, I think it starts with understanding first kind of how habits work in our mind and in our daily life. And they often start with some sort of trigger. So this is sort of like the little habit loop that you can think of. And there's a ton of different pictures you can find on Google to exemplify this for you. This is just the one I picked for today. So the trigger is that initial thing that kind of triggers that habit or your desire for that to do that habit, whatever it is, in your mind. And the trigger is often followed up by your response to it, first emotionally, kind of your emotional response towards that thing, and then the action that you decide to take as a result. So it could be like, okay, you walk into the kitchen, there's chocolate on the counter, you love chocolate, and so you go grab the chocolate and you eat the chocolate. That's your action. And the habit, you can see how that would easily repeat if you always have chocolate on your counter, right? That action, when you take it and it becomes a habit, it releases that dopamine in your brain, which is that feel-good chemical we always talk about, leaves you feeling good and satisfied and pleased with the choice that you've made. It feels happy in that moment, and that's kind of your reward system. After you take that action, you eat the chocolate, whatever it is, you get that reward feeling. So kind of the habit loop there, they use the word cue in this picture. Trigger is another word that you could use. Starts with that trigger for your habit, then the behavior you have or the action that you take as a result, and then your reward. And you can see how this could fit into all kinds of things in your life. We talked about brushing teeth before. So if you have your toothbrush set on a certain place in your bathroom counter, you know, it's very easy. You walk in, you see the toothbrush after you've eaten, you brush your teeth, and that's your habit. You can see how there's the trigger because it's sitting there. The action is that you brush your teeth. The reward, you have nice minty fresh breath, whatever it is. You have all kinds of habits like this in your life that function in this little habit loop. And when you get that dopamine or that reward at the end of it, even if it's not a huge reward, it helps to make you get into that habit loop. You repeat it over and over and over again. So for me, it goes like this. Here's my example of how I see this work in my life in a very powerful way. When I go into a grocery store hungry, which you already know is a bad idea, right? When I go in hungry, I often walk past the chip aisle where all those snacks are. And as I walk past that aisle, it's like it stands out to me in a flashing sign. I see the bag of Cheetos. I love Cheetos way too much. And so, since I know that taste of Cheetos that I have had before and enjoyed so much, when I walk into the store hungry and I see the Cheetos, I have to have the Cheetos. And so I go and I buy the Cheetos. And then on the way home, I eat half the bag of the Cheetos before I even get home. So that's my kind of bad habit loop. And you can see how it would work over and over. Whenever I go into a store hungry, I'm usually going to walk out with a bag of Cheetos. Eddie could tell you all kinds of funny stories about that. It's happened a lot. And I have at least been able to identify my trigger, right? If I go into a grocery store hungry, that's where it tends to start. If I don't have a plan for what I'm going to buy when I go into that store, I'm usually going to end up walking away with Cheetos and all kinds of other unnecessary foods as well. And researchers on habits suggest that this is where we got to start, is recognizing that trigger. If we can, instead of reacting to triggers, if we can instead pick our response ahead of time, that's where that godly self-control comes in. If you can pick your response to the trigger ahead of time and choose how you're going to react, you're more likely to follow through with the action that you really want to happen and avoid the habit action. So just that act of consciously knowing what your trigger is and picking how you're going to respond to it can help you break that habit. That's where it starts. It's that simple. That doesn't sound that hard, does it? Identifying the trigger and choosing what your action is going to be. That all happens before you even do anything. We can do that sitting here in church right now in our minds, thinking about whatever habit it is that you've got that you're wanting to address. And so with my Cheetos habit, here's how I cheat the system, and I'm sure many of you have similar experiences. If I'm being disciplined with myself and having self-control, I make the choice that I'm never going to go into a store hungry. And so when I do go, I make sure that I go after I have had a meal already, or I'm well fed, I'm not starving hungry. And I make sure I go with a pre-made list of the things that I want to buy. And that, in and of itself right there, that halts my trigger. And so I find that when I walk past the chip aisle, I don't have that sense of hungry desire for the Cheetos. So I walk past and I complete the list of the other things that I want to buy. It's like kind of tricking my brain, cheating the system a bit, and saying, I know what's going on in there. I know you want the Cheetos, but not today. We're going to do things differently. And often when I go home and I make the healthy meal that I had decided upon earlier, I feel satisfied. I feel happy. I still get that little bit of dopamine in my brain. I'm glad I made that choice and avoided the Cheetos. Not the Cheetos are evil. You can still have them once in a while, and I allow myself to do that once in a while, but not every single time that I go into a store hungry, right? So if you're trying to start a new habit, or so we've talked a little about breaking old ones. Now we're going to talk about new ones. If you're trying to start a new habit, it's important to start small, not get overwhelmed with the bigness of something you want to change in your life, but just pick something really small, just one thing. Kind of like in that story we talked about. She just picked that she wanted this one goal in her life, and that was able to help her in breaking her cigarette addiction. So for you, just start with something small. One little thing. Just one way that you can kind of trick that little trigger that happens in your brain. One way that you can change that. So say you want to start the habit of flossing. Since many of us, brushing our teeth is automatic, but sometimes we struggle with the flossing aspect. Say you wanted to start that habit. You could say, okay, the trigger I'm going to have is the night before, if you do it in the morning or whenever it is, I'm going to put my floss on top of my toothbrush. That means that I can't pick up my toothbrush without touching the floss, and that's going to remind me I need to floss, and that's going to make you much more likely to do it. So you've got to kind of pick the way that you're going to start this new habit, some sort of a trigger for yourself. You get to invent whatever that trigger is, whatever you want it to be. Say you want to start a new Bible reading plan, or you want to read the Bible just more every day, maybe first thing in the morning. If you've got an alarm clock or you use your phone for your alarm clock, set the Bible on top. So when the alarm goes off, you got to pick up the Bible and move it in order to turn off the alarm. That will trigger you and remind you, oh yeah, I decided I wanted to do this habit today. It's in my hand. I might as well do it. Even if like me, it might take you a little longer to wake up, but it still kind of reminds you, hey, there's this thing that I promised to myself I was going to do. So basically, you've got to make things ridiculously easy for yourself. Sometimes our brains are a little dumb that way, right? We're humans. We've got to trick ourselves a little bit, but make it ridiculously simple, something that's going to be hard for you to ignore. Something small, start small, and then you'll see how in your life it'll start that domino effect. And it takes patience, but it'll start that domino effect of changing bigger things later on. Now, God can start something big in your life, as we talked about, from just one small habit. But maybe as we've been going through this series, you've been overwhelmed or having trouble picking, like, what is the one thing I'm going to work on this year? If I can only pick one small little thing, where do I even start? Maybe you overanalyze yourself or are very self-critical, and so you've got a list of 100 things you want to change, right? Well, here's a little question that I want you to think about today that can help you kind of do some discernment work. Reflect on this question in your time with God, see what He tells you, and it may help you to figure out what that one little habit is that you want to change, or the one little habit is that you want to start. So here's the question for you. Who do you want to become? Or who do you feel like God is calling you to be this year? Just answer that question for yourself. Take some time to reflect with God. Who do you want to become? What kind of person do you want to be? A better spouse, a better friend, a better parent, better grandparent, whatever it is, a more generous person. Whatever your answer is to that question, who do you want to become? Then ask yourself, and see how God helps you with this discernment, what one little habit do you need to start or break in order to become that person? And I'm sure that in your time with God reflecting on that, it'll become clear. He'll make it clear for you where to start. What is that one little habit that you need to start in order to become the person that God is calling you to be? And I hope that in your time with Him this week, He will give you some clarity on that. I know it's something I'm praying about as well, because I'm one of those people that tends to have a long list of things I want to change in my life, and I'm asking God to help me discern and bring it down to just that one little thing to help me become the person that I want to be. And I hope He does that for you this week. Well, let's say a prayer, and then I will send you on your way to have a wonderful Sabbath. Dear God, I want to thank you for the work that you do in our lives and for being consistent and faithful with us. and helping us to recognize that as we're going on this journey of habits, it's okay that we're not perfect, and it's okay that we're going to mess up, and that we're going to try to start these new habits and try and break old ones, and it's not always going to go right, and that's all right. You're going to be with us every step of the way. And this week, I want to ask that you really inspire each one of us as we reflect on that question of who we want to become, what kind of people we want to be, which ultimately affects what kind of church we are, both locally here in this church and globally as Seventh-day Adventists. And I ask that you would inspire each one of us and help us see what that one little habit is that we can start, and what that one little trigger can be for us, a way to trick our brains, so that we can slowly start becoming that person that you're calling us to be. More loving, more forgiving, more kind. Thank you for the work of discernment that you do in our hearts in this process, God. And I want to thank you for who you are. As we part ways this Sabbath, keep us safe on the roads home, and help us to have a restful weekend and really enjoy this time of Sabbath rest with you. In your name, amen. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your Sabbath.